Nality had always been known as a gentle, kind woman in Kigali. For 12 years, she had built a life with her husband, Taye. They shared laughter, struggles, and dreams, or so she thought. Lately, though, Taye had grown cold. Nights grew longer without him at home. When Nality asked where he had been, he brushed her off with excuses, his eyes always on his phone, his smile no longer reaching her. It didn't take long for the truth to come out. Whispers in town reached her ears, and soon Nality discovered what she had feared. Taye was not working late. He was with someone else. Zinal, his young secretary, had taken the space Nality once filled. Friends pitied her, but Nality held her head high, never allowing her pain to show in public. One evening, Taye came home, not with shame, but with arrogance. He tossed papers on the table. "I want a divorce," he said with a smirk. His voice carried no regret, only mockery. "You have nothing. I'm taking everything." The words cut deep, yet Nality did not cry, shout, or plead. Instead, she looked at him with calm eyes that unsettled him more than anger ever could. Without hesitation, she picked up the pen and signed her name. Her hand did not shake, her face did not break. Taye walked away believing he had won. What he never guessed, what no one knew, was that Nality's silence was not surrender. It was the beginning of something greater. Weeks after the divorce, Taye seemed to be enjoying his new life. Everywhere he went in Kigali, Zinal was by his side. She was young, always dressed to impress, laughing loudly at his jokes. Taye made sure everyone noticed them. He walked into restaurants holding her hand, introduced her as if she were a prize he had just won, and told people how happy he finally was. For him, it wasn't just about love. It was about making sure Nality saw what she had lost. Soon, he planned a big party and invited many of Nality's old friends, the very people who had once admired their marriage. The invitation wasn't kindness. It was a trap, a chance to parade Zinal in front of those who had known Nality for years. People whispered about it, some shocked at Taye's boldness, others curious about how Nality would handle it. On the night of the party, the music was loud, the lights glittered, and the air was thick with perfume and champagne. Zinal stood close to Taye, her dress shining, her laughter echoing across the room. When Nality finally arrived, she walked in quietly, wearing a simple but elegant dress. She didn't try to compete with Zinal's sparkle. Her grace was quieter, calmer, the kind that didn't need attention to be noticed. But people noticed anyway. Conversations paused. Some whispered, "That's Nality." Others watched closely to see what would happen when the two women were in the same room. Taye, drunk on attention, couldn't resist the moment. He pulled Zinal closer and smirked as Nality passed. "This," he said loudly enough for others to hear, "is what a real woman looks like." The cruelty in his words cut through the room like a blade. Some people gasped, others looked away in embarrassment. Nality stopped for only a second. Instead of replying, she smiled softly, her calm eyes meeting Taye's for the briefest moment. She didn't defend herself, didn't give him the drama he wanted. She simply walked past him with quiet dignity, greeting her friends with warmth as though nothing had happened. That silence worked like a mirror. It unsettled Taye. He had expected tears, anger, or humiliation. But Nality's gentle smile carried a strength he couldn't understand. For the rest of the evening, even as he tried to laugh louder and show off Zinal more, he kept glancing at Nality. Her silence followed him like a shadow, reminding him that maybe he hadn't broken her after all. And as the whispers continued around the room, they weren't about Zinal's beauty or Taye's bragging. They were about Nality, the woman who had been mocked in public yet walked with her head high, untouched by the insult. That night, without saying a single word, she won back the respect of everyone watching. After the party, life shifted quickly. Zinal was no longer just Taye's pretty secretary. She began sliding into places where Nality used to stand. She whispered in his ear about business deals, corrected him in front of his friends, and even started making decisions about his family. At first, people thought Taye would never allow such control, but he seemed to enjoy it. The thrill of having a younger woman who spoke with confidence made him feel powerful. He laughed off any advice from his siblings or old business partner. "Zinal knows what's best," he would say with pride. Taye was so caught up in this new life that he didn't notice the walls of his old one crumbling. Nality, meanwhile, had quietly moved into a small rented flat on the other side of Kigali. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms, simple furniture, and a balcony where she sometimes sat at night with a cup of tea. But it was hers. Friends pitied her, wondering how she could accept such a fall from grace. But Nality didn't complain. She kept to herself, leaving early every morning for her job as an accountant, returning late, tired but steady. Behind closed doors, her life was far from broken. She poured herself into her work, organizing numbers with precision, building plans, and carefully balancing her income. People saw only the surface, a quiet, divorced woman starting over. What they didn't see was the secret Nality carried close to her heart. Years before, Long before Taye and Zinel, she had taken a leap of faith and invested a portion of her savings into a small company few believed in at the time, Umoyo Industries. Back then, it was just another tech startup, fragile and uncertain. Taye had laughed at her, calling her foolish for even considering it. But Nality trusted her instincts and quietly held on to her shares. Now, Umoyo Industries was no longer small. It was one of the fastest-growing tech companies in Rwanda, making headlines and attracting global investors. Nality kept her role hidden, never speaking of it to anyone. Even her closest friends had no idea. As Taye strutted around Kigali with Zinel, mocking Nality's modest lifestyle, he was completely blind to the truth, that the woman he thought he had left with nothing was sitting on a fortune that was still growing. Every evening, after finishing her day's work, Nality would open her laptop and read the latest financial reports, watching her shares climb higher. She didn't rush. She didn't brag. She knew patience was her greatest strength. For now, she let Taye laugh, let him play the king with his new queen. Because deep inside, Nality knew a time was coming when the game would turn, and the people who mocked her would realize she had never been powerless at all. She had simply been waiting. Long before the divorce, before Zinel, before Taye's arrogance swallowed their marriage, Nality had made a decision that would change her life. It was almost 10 years ago, when she was still hopeful about her future with Taye. At that time, she had managed to save a small amount from her accounting work. It wasn't much, just enough to buy a second-hand car, or maybe help with house renovations. But instead of spending it, she listened carefully to a young entrepreneur who came to her office one afternoon, pitching an idea about a company called Umoyo Industries. Most people had laughed at him. Tech won't survive in Rwanda, some said. Others dismissed him as a dreamer with no real plan. Even Taye, when Nality mentioned it at home, scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous," he told her. "You're too soft for business. You'll just lose everything." His words stung, but Nality stayed quiet, storing the idea away. Deep down, she had always believed in numbers, in growth, in possibilities that others overlooked. So, against her husband's judgment, she took the risk. Quietly, without telling him, she invested her savings into Umoyo Industries. It was a small amount compared to what others could have put in, but it was everything she had. She signed the papers with steady hands, praying silently that she wasn't being foolish. Then she carried on with her life, never mentioning it again. Years passed, and slowly, the gamble began to blossom. At first, she barely noticed the change. A quarterly report would come, showing modest growth. Then the company launched a product that caught attention, and suddenly headlines began to appear. Global investors started calling. What had once been seen as a fragile startup was now a rising star in East Africa's tech world. Nality's shares, left untouched for years, had grown beyond anything she could have imagined. That small risk had multiplied into a fortune, millions on paper, with more still growing. Through all of this, she never breathed a word to Taye. Why should she? He had never taken her seriously. He had called her too stupid for business, told her to stick to cooking and cleaning while he handled real money. He believed she was just an ordinary wife, dependent on him for everything. And Nality let him believe it. Now, sitting in her small rented flat, Nality knew the truth. She had more power than Taye could ever guess. With her stake in Umoyo Industries, she could influence not just her own life, but even the world Taye thought he controlled. He had mocked her for having nothing, yet she had built something greater than he ever dreamed. For the first time in years, Nality felt the quiet thrill of knowing she was no longer the woman left behind. She was the woman holding the keys to a future Taye would soon regret underestimating. Taye's empire had always looked shiny from the outside. Expensive cars lined his driveway, his suits were perfectly tailored, and his voice carried the kind of confidence that made people believe he was untouchable. But the truth was different. Behind closed doors, cracks were beginning to show. His businesses, once stable, were now bleeding money. Deals were poorly managed, staff left without warning, and debts quietly piled up. What used to be profit was now being swallowed by mistakes and arrogance. Zinel, of course, didn't notice or didn't care. For her, life was about luxury. She had tasted wealth and wanted more. More shopping trips, more gold jewelry, more designer handbags. "Why don't we move into a bigger house?" she suggested one evening, her tone sharp when Taye hesitated. "People are buying mansions in Nairobi. Why shouldn't we?" Taye laughed it off, but her demands stuck to him like thorns. Every time he bought her another car or hosted another party, the hole in his finances grew deeper. Still, in public, Taye bragged louder than ever. At social gatherings, he clinked glasses and announced new deals that weren't real. He boasted about profits he hadn't seen in months. Friends admired him, competitors envied him, and Zinel stayed by his side, smiling as if she were queen of Kigali. But when the lights went out and the crowd was gone, Taye sat in his office staring at overdue bills. Banks started calling. Suppliers demanded payment. The empire he flaunted was crumbling, but he refused to let anyone see him sweat. In his desperation, he began borrowing, first from banks, then from private lenders. He signed papers quickly, barely reading the fine print, thinking he could fix everything with one big win. But with every loan, the noose tightened around his neck. He didn't realize that the money keeping him afloat was no longer faceless. The largest investor behind those loans, the quiet force propping up his fragile empire, was Nality herself. She had stepped in with precision, never revealing her identity, using her fortune and connections through Yumoyo Industries to buy the very debts Taye thought belonged to anonymous banks. Every time he borrowed, every time he promised to pay back with interest, Nality was on the other side of the table, silently watching his empire sink deeper into her control. While he mocked her as a woman who had nothing, she was quietly becoming the shadow behind his survival. It was almost poetic, Taye, so full of pride, unknowingly leaning on the very woman he had humiliated. And Nality, steady and patient, made no rush to reveal the truth. She simply let him borrow, let him dig his hole deeper, waiting for the moment when the cracks would turn into a collapse he could no longer hide. Nality moved like a shadow, quiet, unnoticed, but deliberate with every step. While Taye spent his nights parading Zinal through Kigali's hotspots, showing off his fading wealth, Nality was at her desk late into the evening, reviewing documents, making phone calls, and slowly pulling the strings that would shape her future. She didn't rush, she didn't boast. She worked with the calm focus of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to gain. Her first move was to increase her shares in Yumoyo Industries. She already owned enough to be comfortable, but Nality wasn't interested in comfort anymore. She wanted control. When smaller shareholders decided to cash out, she quietly bought them out, little by little, until the balance tipped in her favor. By the time anyone noticed, Nality was no longer just an investor. She was the majority shareholder, the one with the loudest voice in the company's decision. From there, her reach began to stretch. She partnered with sharp investors who respected her intelligence, people who were tired of dealing with reckless men like Taye. Together, they started targeting key assets linked to his businesses. Land he depended on, suppliers he needed, even small companies tied to his chain of operations. One by one, they slipped out of his hands and into hers. Each move was quiet, legal, and brilliantly disguised. On paper, it looked like random market shifts. In reality, Nality was weaving a web that slowly tightened around him. Meanwhile, Taye noticed nothing. He was too busy living loudly, arriving at restaurants in rented luxury cars, throwing parties he couldn't afford, and bragging about business deals he hadn't actually secured. Every time Zinal demanded another diamond necklace, or whispered about buying a new mansion, he promised her it would happen. To everyone watching, he seemed unstoppable, but to those who knew the truth, he was dancing on thin ice. Nality didn't interrupt. She let him play his role, let him keep believing he was the king of Kigali. What amused her most was how he still spoke of her with disdain, telling anyone who would listen that his ex-wife had been useless and slow. He had no idea she was the storm gathering right above him, the one preparing to strike when he least expected it. Each night, when she closed her laptop, Nality would sit back with a small smile. She wasn't driven by revenge. It was deeper than that. This was about balance, about dignity, about proving to herself that she had always been capable, even when he tried to convince her otherwise. The world that had once belonged to Taye was slowly shifting, piece by piece, into her hands. The storm was ready to break. And Taye, blind in his arrogance, still stood in the open, laughing, with no idea that the thunder was already on its way. The night of the gala was one of those events that Kigali's elite never missed. The hall sparkled with crystal chandeliers, champagne flowed like water, and the air buzzed with music and laughter. Taye arrived fashionably late, Zinal on his arm in a glittering dress that caught every eye. He walked through the crowd as if he owned the room, greeting people with loud laughter, clapping shoulders, boasting about deals he hadn't made and profits he hadn't earned. To him, appearances were everything, and tonight, he was determined to show everyone that he was still on top. Zinal played her part perfectly. She smiled, leaned on his arm, and laughed loudly at his every word. Together, they looked like the couple everyone should envy. People watched, some admiring, some whispering behind their glasses. But no one dared say aloud what many already suspected, that Taye's empire was cracking under the weight of debt. The evening went on, filled with music, speeches, and clinking glasses. Then, just as Taye was in the middle of bragging about a massive new contract, the lights dimmed and a hush fell over the hall. A presenter stepped onto the stage, holding a microphone, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "tonight we have a very special announcement. As you know, Yumoyo Industries has become one of the fastest-growing companies in Africa. And tonight, we proudly introduce our new chairperson." The room leaned in, curious. Some expected a foreign investor. Others thought it might be one of Kigali's well-known businessmen. But when the name was spoken, the entire hall froze. Nality and Shooty. Gasps rippled across the room. Heads turned, eyes widened. At the far end of the hall, Nality rose from her seat. She wasn't in glitter or diamonds, but in a simple, elegant gown that seemed to glow with dignity. Calm, graceful, she walked to the stage as though she had always belonged there. Taye's laughter died instantly. The glass in his hand slipped, shattering on the floor. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Zinal's smile faltered as whispers spread faster than fire. "That's his ex-wife," someone muttered. "She's the new chairperson?" Another voice added, "She owns Yumoyo?" Nality reached the podium and looked out at the crowd. She didn't rush. Her silence was powerful enough to keep the hall still. Taye's face burned as he stared at her, confusion and disbelief fighting across his expression. For the first time, the power was no longer his. Nality stood in the light, and he was just another man in the crowd. The humiliation was sharp, but worse than that was the realization. The woman he had mocked, discarded, and paraded as weak had outplayed him completely. And as the applause rose for Nality, Taye could only sit there, his empire collapsing in front of the very people he had spent years trying to impress. The room was still buzzing when Nality reached the podium. She stood tall, her calm presence filling the hall without needing to raise her voice. The lights reflected softly off her gown, but it wasn't her appearance that held everyone's attention. It was her quiet strength. "Life," she began, her voice steady and warm, "has a way of testing us. Sometimes we lose what we thought we could never live without. Sometimes we are broken down so others can watch us fall. But resilience is not about fighting loudly. It is about standing with dignity, even when the world thinks you have nothing left." The hall was silent. Every word carried weight. People leaned forward, listening, some nodding, others blinking back emotion. Nality continued, her tone never bitter, only steady. "I am honored to serve as the new chairperson of Yumoyo Industries. This is not just my victory. It is proof that with patience, with hard work, and with faith, even the most silent among us can rise." The applause that followed was thunderous. Cameras flashed, people stood to clap, and the whispers began to grow louder. Whispers not about Taye, but about Nality, the woman who had turned quiet suffering into undeniable power. At his table, Taye's face drained of color. He suddenly realized the truth. Nality was not only the chairperson of Yumoyo, she was also the hidden investor who had been holding his debts. His empire, every loan, every lifeline was tangled in her hands. His pride collapsed under the weight of the revelation. For years, he had mocked her as useless, and now she controlled more of his future than he ever imagined. Zinal, who had been clinging to his arm all evening, shifted uncomfortably. Her eyes darted around as people whispered and laughed. It didn't take long for her to understand what this meant. A man with no money, no power, no influence? That wasn't the life she had signed up for. Slowly, she pulled her hand away from Taye's. Her laughter, once loud and bright, was gone. By the end of the evening, she slipped quietly out of the hall, leaving him alone at his table. Around him, the humiliation grew heavier. Guests who once toasted his success now whispered behind their glasses. Some smirked, others shook their heads. A few didn't even bother to hide their laughter. Taye tried to straighten his shoulders, to smile as if nothing was wrong, but his confidence had cracked. Every glance reminded him that he was no longer admired, no longer envied. And yet, the cruelest part wasn't the whispers or Zinal's absence. It was the sight of Nality on stage, poised and radiant, receiving applause that once belonged to him. In that moment, Taye realized he hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost the only person who ever had the strength to stand beside him, and now she was standing far above him, untouchable. The room was still buzzing when Nality reached the podium. She stood tall, her calm presence filling the hall without needing to raise her voice. The lights reflected softly off her gown, but it wasn't her appearance that held everyone's attention. It was her quiet strength. "Life," she began, her voice steady and warm, "has a way of testing us. Sometimes we lose what we thought we could never live without. Sometimes we are broken down so others can watch us fall. But resilience is not about fighting loudly. It is about standing with dignity, even when the world thinks you have nothing." The hall was silent. Every word carried weight. People leaned forward, listening, some nodding, others blinking back emotion. Nality continued, her tone never bitter, only steady. "I am honored to serve as the new chairperson of Yumoyo Industries. This is not just my victory. It is proof that with patience, with hard work, and with faith, even the most silent among us can rise." The applause that followed was thunderous. Cameras flashed, people stood to clap, and the whispers began to grow louder. Whispers not about Taye, but about Nality, the woman who had turned quiet suffering into undeniable power. At his table, Taye's face drained of color. He suddenly realized the truth. Nality was not only the chairperson of Yumoyo, she was also the hidden investor who had been holding his debts. His empire, every loan, every lifeline, was tangled in her hands. His pride collapsed under the weight of the revelation. For years, he had mocked her as useless, and now she controlled more of his future than he ever imagined. Zinel, who had been clinging to his arm all evening, shifted uncomfortably. Her eyes darted around as people whispered and laughed. It didn't take long for her to understand what this meant. A man with no money, no power, no influence? That wasn't the life she had signed up for. Slowly, she pulled her hand away from Taye's. Her laughter, once loud and bright, was gone. By the end of the evening, she slipped quietly out of the hall, leaving him alone at his table. Around him, the humiliation grew heavier. Guests who once toasted his success now whispered behind their glasses. Some smirked, others shook their heads. A few didn't even bother to hide their laughter. Taye tried to straighten his shoulders, to smile as if nothing was wrong, but his confidence had cracked. Every glance reminded him that he was no longer admired, no longer envied. And yet, the cruelest part wasn't the whispers or Zinel's absence. It was the sight of Nality on stage, poised and radiant, receiving applause that once belonged to him. In that moment, Taye realized he hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost the only person who ever had the strength to stand beside him, and now she was standing far above him, untouchable. The gala ended with Nality surrounded by handshakes, congratulations, and admiration. She carried herself with quiet grace, smiling politely, thanking people without a trace of arrogance. On the other side of the hall, Taye sat alone, his glass empty, his shoulders slumped. The world he had built on pride and appearances had shattered in a single night. When the crowd thinned and the music faded, he finally gathered the courage to approach her. He found her in the corridor outside, where the lights were dimmer and the noise of celebration was far behind. For a moment, he simply stared at her. This was the woman he had mocked, abandoned, and humiliated. Yet here she stood, unshaken, stronger than ever. "Nality," he said, his voice low, almost broken. She turned, calm as ever. "Taye." His eyes were tired, his face lined with desperation. I didn't know," he admitted. "I underestimated you. I thought you were nothing without me." His words stumbled out, heavy with regret. "I mocked you, betrayed you, and now look at me. I'm ruined. Everything I built is gone." For the first time, there was no arrogance in his tone. He was not the man who once paraded Zinel in front of her. He was just a man stripped of power, standing before the woman he had once called weak. Nality listened quietly, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke, her words clear and steady, like a knife cutting through the silence. "You left me with nothing. I built everything. That's the difference between us." Taye's eyes glistened, but he had no reply. The truth stung too deeply. He wanted to beg further, to fall at her feet, but something in her calm gaze told him it was useless. Nality didn't shout. She didn't gloat. She didn't remind him of the insults, the betrayals, or the humiliation. Her simple words carried more weight than any lecture could. They showed him the gap between them now, a gap too wide to cross. She adjusted the shawl on her shoulders, gave him one last look, and then turned to walk away. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor as she disappeared into the night. Taye stood frozen in the corridor, surrounded by silence. All the pride he had once worn like armor had crumbled, leaving him bare. The woman he had thrown aside now held the power he once worshipped. And worst of all, she had no intention of ever looking back. For Nality, the moment was not about revenge. It was about closure. She left him there with nothing but his regrets, while she stepped forward into a future she had built with her own strength. Taye was left in ruins, not of money or business, but of pride. And that loss was greater than any fortune. Nality's rise could have been a story of revenge, but that was never her heart. With her wealth and influence, she chose a different path. Instead of chasing Taye's downfall, she focused on lifting others who had once stood where she had been, broken, abandoned, left to start over with nothing. She created a foundation in Kigali dedicated to supporting divorced and abandoned women, giving them financial training, job opportunities, and a safe community to rebuild their lives. The foundation grew quickly, and so did Nality's reputation. She was invited to speak at universities, business forums, and community gatherings. People admired not only her success, but her grace. She didn't use her story to shame anyone. She used it to inspire. Women saw in her a reminder that losing a marriage did not mean losing yourself. Men, too, respected her for her dignity and quiet strength. On the night of her foundation's first anniversary, a grand event was held in Kigali. The hall was filled with lights, music, and laughter. Nality stood on stage, addressing a crowd that clapped and cheered for her vision. Cameras flashed, her name was praised, and her calm smile lit up the room. Outside, on the street, Taye happened to pass by. He was alone now, his clothes worn, his face tired. Through the open doors, he saw Nality at the podium, bathed in applause. For a long moment he watched, the weight of regret pressing down on him. Nality noticed him from the stage. She did not frown or gloat. She simply smiled, a calm, steady smile that spoke of peace. The victory was not revenge. It was freedom. And in that freedom, Nality finally shone brighter than ever.